Welcome back to The Navel Gaze. I'm Aaron Terrell. That's my co-host, Tolly Botts, and we are very excited to be joined today by the one and only Laura Becker. We've been kind of planning this for a little while, had some scheduling mishaps, but we are super stoked to get you here to be able to talk about your whole transition, detransition, the whole AAP element, because again, like I really appreciate you're one of the few FTM to Fs to, or however you want to classify that, to own this and to talk about it. Obviously, we believe it affects a lot more than just those of us who are openly talking about it. But anyway, by the by, thank you so much for being here, Laura.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me. I'm very open and just am interested in psychoeducation and being as self-aware as possible and helping others to discover, maybe some shadow stuff that they're not admitting, and then just to help people to have as much information as they can handle and then to make wise decisions based upon it. So that's why I'm here.
Exactly. Awesome.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And I think, not to sidetrack too long, although that's what I'm famous for doing, I think what you said about psychoeducation and just giving people as much information as possible to understand themselves and to make the best decisions for their lives is so important. And to me is like what is critically missing from quote unquote trans healthcare, even if we're just talking about adults and people over 18. And I think, a conversation that I've had with some, I talk to trans people and gender criticals, I feel like I'm in this weird middle space. And a lot of the trans people who are sympathetic to me and where I stand are frustrated when I say things like there should be some type of, I've sort of framed it as exploratory therapy, but I basically mean like some professional talking to you to break down what's at the root of this, like what is the source of these feelings, what might be going on, and putting and giving you the tools of like, well, we know that sometimes these things are related to sexuality, and just putting it all out there so the person can make the best decision for themselves. Not necessarily someone who's going to say, no, you can't do this or shouldn't do this, but providing the individual with the most information possible is something that I think is just obviously lacking from the current trans affirmative protocol that most people are funneled through. So yeah, we're really, really glad to have you here today. Laura, you were one of the first detransitioners. It was you and Michelle who really stick out in my mind of people whose stories I read about and watched, like some of your early YouTube stuff when I was first sort of peaking. And you guys were the first videos that I showed to my wife when she started the process of sort of desisting. And so I owe a big debt to you for being so public about your story for so long. So thank you. And yeah, it's kind of cool to come full circle of you and my wife both kind of feeling like the root of a lot of these feelings were this sort of quirky, atypical sexuality. And so, yeah, we're excited to talk to you about that today. And I think you have a interesting perspective because you've detransitioned, so you're not sort of living the cross-sex life anymore, and you're someone that's, as you already sort of said, you're sort of trying not to make the gender thing your whole life or your whole scope, and that sort of gender and sexuality, I think sexuality, we try to emphasize how it's so much larger than sex on the one hand, right? Sexuality is not just sexual attraction and sexual activity, but it also doesn't need to be everything. And there are ways to like recognize this as one component of who you are without allowing it to be the largest part of you. So yeah, all that to say, we're excited to talk to you. So I think my first question to start off would be, when did you first hear about autoandrophilia? And then from that point to you saying, okay, this kind of makes sense for my experience, what was that journey like?
The first memory, I mean, I might have heard about it before, but not internalized it. But the one I clearly remember is Phil Illy, our good friend Phil Illy. He emailed me and he was like, Laura, I saw your interview on Soft White Underbelly when I was talking about my unrequited loves for gay men and thinking I have to be a gay man in order to be loved for myself and my personality and everything. And he was like, it kind of sounds like you might have some autoandrophilia. And then he shared maybe some quotes from his book that he was working on at the time. Maybe it had come out, but I was like, you know what? That sounds very accurate to my experience. And then I shared with him some erotic material that I've never actually shared with another person, some poems that I'd written when I was in college, when I was wrestling the most with coming out as a gay trans man. And all these poems were, well, I once submitted them to a poetry contest. And the judge was like, this isn't right for us, but we definitely appreciate this sleazy gay poetry that you have. And that was how it was described, even though it was very much like a female that's
Right.
into men, wrestling with these this obsession with the phallus and obsession with gay male, erotic desire and yearning and unrequited love and things. So yeah, when Phil told me about it, I was like, yeah, I'm not going to argue with that. And since then, Phil and I have had many discussions about these things, and we don't agree on everything, but to deny that it exists, to deny that there is this paraphilia, that there is this fantasy that gets wrapped up in people's disassociation from their bodies and leads to really dangerous medicalization and harm going on psychologically and physically, is absurd. So I don't want to ever deny reality, even if we can debate about, how it functions. It still is functioning, right? So that's kind of my position on it.
So I guess I'm really, I have follow-ups to this, which is like, what was your relationship with Phil before he sent you that email? And what was your impression of maybe even autogynephilia? And I ask this because I feel like from the people that I've spoken to in the conversations that I've had, the hardest part is like the framing, or like getting someone to accept it as a possibility. I feel like there's a large block for a lot of people that even if it might be accurate to them, they're really turned off by the concept, or it feels like an accusation or a threat in some way. So I'm always surprised by people who basically on the first time hearing it are like, yeah, that sounds right. So yeah, if you could walk us through, like, had you spoken to Phil before? What was your relationship like with him? And what did you know about autogynephilia at that point?
Yeah, so Phil and I had no prior relationship or interaction before that. He was just some guy that seemed thoughtful and seemed to be researching the subject, and I'm very open. So I was like, yeah, that sounds accurate. And I did not have a prior conception of him. But I did have a very strong prior conception and judgment of autogynephilia, because I think a lot of women, when they start to question the ideology, when they start to detransition, one of the most obvious ways that a mirror is held up on all of the ideology is to look at the very overt narcissistic AGP males that are just literally parading their fetish around. I mean, that is not just a euphemism, right? That is what they're doing, some of these guys. And then it becomes very clear how their male entitlement specifically manifests through the trans narcissism, and then how FTMs have this internalized misogyny. And again, these are all buzzwords, but that's not to say that it doesn't happen. So I think a lot of women like myself, when I started detransitioning mentally sort of on my own when I was diagnosed with PTSD from childhood abuse and from the transition. And I saw that it hadn't helped, it had harmed me. But then posting about it on Tumblr and some radical feminist content started coming up, and they started messaging me and, showing that there's other women that are going through this same pain. I have had male abuse. I was abused by my father and have trauma from that. So when I learned about internalized misogyny, I was like, oh, I see that there are a type of women who are abused that do that through transition. And then that mirror is held up by the opposite, which is these male perpetrators. And it's very black and white, and it's very easy to start to peak because of that. But obviously we call it peaking because it's just like the beginning of, oh, the turning point. Then we realize how much more complicated it is, and it takes years to unravel the trauma and everything else. It's multidimensional. So yeah, I had the same very normal, gender critical, radical feminist sort of ideas about AGP. The difference, I think, with me is that I pretty quickly started to outgrow the radical feminist ideas because they helped me, and I'll always be very thankful to them, those women that helped me. But I outgrew it because I saw that it was very reductionist. It was very misandrist. And I'm not a misandrist. I do love men very much. And I appreciate masculinity in the world and both sexes contributing to the continuation of the species.
Yes.
So that's just a radical opinion, I know, but
crazy.
But I'm like, guys, this has been good, but I want to do more with my life than just making fun of troons. And then I already sort of detached from it. And I'm like, I'm not going to be in another kind of, judgmental space. So I've always been very independently minded, and didn't agree with, I wasn't part of their clique. So I'd already detached from the clique of the rad femmes before I met Phil, which I think is pretty crucial to understanding why I was then so open to it.
Yeah. That's awesome. Gosh, you said so much there that like you're kind of preaching to the choir with me and Aaron.
I know.
The two main things that stick out there are, number one, what you said of like so much of this stuff, including the like most extreme and maybe villainized version of AGP, is sort of necessary. Like it is what gets people's foot in the door. It, like you said, it's the starkest example of how ridiculous some of this is. It slaps you in the face. It's a truth bomb. And some of the frustration that Aaron and I find is like, okay, cool, that this is what we were all thinking and feeling like 5 years ago, or whenever someone steps into this space and peaks and whatever. And then it's like, now it's 5 years later. It's like, and I feel like some people are stuck in these same, I'm going to make fun of troons all day. Autogynephiles are evil, redemptionless, perverts. And I'm just like, how really, like, we're still stuck here. So I really relate to that, and to the radical feminism thing. This is something that I don't struggle with it so much anymore. Or rather like, yeah, I guess I appreciated the way that you said it because that's how I felt too. And I feel like maybe I'm a little more dismissive of the radical feminists today, but they served a purpose for me too. Certainly. The radical feminists in many ways gave me permission to become gender critical because I was coming from the left. I was coming from the far left, and as a queer person myself and whatever. And it looks like, when you just look in, the anti-trans people are the conservative Christian people, which again, now I think very differently about conservative Christian people. Neither of those words are slurs to me in the way they were when I first got into this conversation. But the radical feminists gave me permission to be in this conversation because so many of them were still on the left. They were feminists. Like you could still be I felt like I could still be a good person and pursue this gender critical fight because I was with the feminists. And some of this stuff does make some sense, or rather like it serves a purpose. It allows you to see certain things. It allows you to question certain things. But I think it also, yeah, it's really reductive. It is really anti-man in a lot of ways.
Anti-human.
Yeah,
anti-human.
Like, kind of what you were implying. It's like anti-natalist. It's like just anti-human reproduction. It's just very self-defeating, pretty within a generation at least.
Yeah, and I also think like there's a danger there, as I'm sure you know, Laura, like sometimes people give up one ideology for another. And I feel like there's a bit of a slippery slope with the radical feminism in particular, that it can serve as even like a cope. And it's sort of like, and especially I think for some detransitioners too, who like, live as men, and then they come to regret that and resent their time doing that, and to lean into their feminine power and to the women around them. And all of this is really good. And it's actually helping them, like you said, get out of this really toxic and detrimental path that they may have been on. And then they stay there because it helps them deal with not like, it's like, I won't have to deal with the temptation to be masculine anymore if I just totally vilify and villainize everything that is masculine. And I heard a detransitioner once talking about how part of her process of detransition in the radical feminist style was that she stopped listening to male music. She stopped looking at male art. Like, she just cut everything man out of her life. And I'm like, this doesn't actually seem like the best way to cope with a detransition, and doesn't seem like a healthy way to reintegrate into life. And so,
Right.
yeah, I really appreciated that you said that, because I relate to that, of like, the radical feminism really did something for me and opened my eyes in so many ways. And then I saw pretty quickly after that it was a problematic movement in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's very, as we've discussed before, it's kind of like, it seems like for a lot of these detransitioners who probably have the same sort of root sexuality that you and I do, Laura, that radical feminism is kind of a handy repression tool, where it's like, men are so terrible, they're the root of all evil in the world, and women are so great, women are so in contrast to males. And I think it's kind of a handy kind of mental protection mechanism from over idealizing and envying men. Is like, this is just, I'm so grateful I'm not the dirty evil sex, I belong to the pure and noble sex. And so it's like I think there's a lot of the appeal of radical feminism to many is that kind of repression that it provides is anyway a theory that we've got over here.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I take it I think of masculinity and femininity often in philosophical ways. So like the anima and the animus, for instance, of Carl Jung, like integrating the masculine and the feminine energies. What does it mean to be masculine? Like an active, penetrating, dominant leading kind of energy, versus the feminine, more of a receiving, nurturing sort of energy. I think about that a lot. And I think that it's not healthy to human flourishing to avoid what we fear and to avoid men. I mean, this radical feminism is a very trauma-based movement. So, and detransition is a trauma-based movement as well. And I'd like to think of it as a recovery movement. But when you get stuck in the trauma-based and you don't outgrow that, you need the phase of accepting that you've been victimized. But you need to graduate to being a survivor, and then graduate to integrating into the things that you have feared, including in yourself. And that very much includes sexuality. It includes shadow impulses. It includes the porn that we've been consuming. It includes the perpetrating that we've done on other people or ourselves. And we need to integrate these dueling forces. Like the yin and yang symbol is very precious to me, because I really do believe in seeing, the light and the shadow in everything, and understanding there is no noble sex. There is no pure sex. There is no innocence, inherent to one sex or the other, that both here serve specific functions. And those are neutral functions. And with the power that a male and a female have, they can cause great harm and destruction, or they can use that for creation and uplifting humanity. And obviously there's a toxic femininity as well as a toxic masculinity. Yeah. And I've seen that play out so much in my own life. I've been a perpetrator as well as a victim in many different ways, and including on men. And so I don't know, maybe I'm just more into the integrating the shadow than a lot of these people are. I think what I've been realizing is the only difference between me and others is courage, like to face truth. Because everyone has these same problems for the most part. It's just not as many will feel it and then be like, I need to change that. So yeah, I understand why they get stuck in it, but yeah, at the end of the day, it's not really productive to avoid the things that trigger us. If we really want to heal, we need to regulate ourselves, which again, we've all discussed the Phil Illy Gen Spec conference controversy, and some people were like, his presence is triggering, and I'm like, okay, but those are your triggers to manage.
Yeah.
I think it gets to this root that I see, like in the gender critical movement, which is also obviously completely integrated with the detransition movement. It seems like there's people who are in it as, I kind of frame it as like a think tank to try to solve this problem, and then those are in it who are in it as like a recovery support group kind of deal. And so the people who have that kind of recovery support group approach to their involvement in gender critical activism, it makes complete intuitive sense to them that Phil was a imposition and just should not have been there. They likely feel the exact same way about my presence there. It's just not as, people don't get as offended or as upset about female transitioners as clearly a man in a dress kind of just triggers these feelings that they're, anyway, he was able to be a scapegoat, I guess. But I think there are those kind of like dueling perspectives where it's like, are we looking at this as a problem that needs to be solved, or are we looking at this as a support group to belong to? And I think both are good. Like both are good. Both should be there for that purpose, but it just can't be both simultaneously, I guess.
Well, I want to take that one step further, because I agree with those two sort of camps, and I'm sure there are more camps, but I think that's a decent breakdown of like what we're looking at: people who are kind of recovering from this experience, and people who are interested in sort of diagnosing what's going on culturally and figuring out how to move forward. I think there's within the recovery group, I think there's a small number of detransitioners or desisters, people who have kind of like walked the gender line and are coming back. But I think the largest part of that recovery group, frankly, is the people who feel like they're leading the recovery. And that is a lot of the radical feminists. Mm-hmm. And maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I felt like a lot of the complaints, if we talk about Blue Dress Gate, I feel like sometimes the victims, and again, that's a tricky word, and I'm totally with you, Laura, that people who go through these experiences need to be able to reframe themselves from victim to survivor and then to just human living in this world. And I know that from my own long ago, whatever experiences. But for the victims, let's say, who it's fresh for, the recent detransitioners or something like that, I feel like a lot of them were sort of were and are actively online encouraged to be re-victimized, to be triggered by a lot of these things, to feel like to perpetuate their victimhood. And that provides safety in some ways, and that provides comfort, and it provides community, but that's not good for any individual's mental health to be stewing in that all the time, to have that perpetuated. And it's not setting people up for reality. And it's funny because it's almost a perfect analogy to the trans stuff. Like I talked to trans, I was just in there was a space the other day of these calling themselves sort of moderate trans people who are looking for the center to move forward with their activism. And I got on the stage and I said, basically, my plea here is that all of you allow yourselves to be misgendered. I said, if not only for the reason that you won't be able to control everyone in the world, and it's going to happen, and you can't crumble. I was like, many of you know, if you've been transitioned for many years, you know that you need to have a thick skin. And so you can't just crumble when this happens. The same thing, you can't just crumble when you see a troon out in public. You can't just crumble when you see a really gender non-conforming, you can't crumble when you see a cross-dresser out in public. We're not helping people. if we tell them that, yes, every space needs to be a safe space just for them, that they're going to be affirmed in, or that they're going to be protected from the affirmation in. And so I don't think it's healthy, and it happens a lot. And a lot of it, I will say, is with good intentions. I think on both sides of this, frankly, most people have good intentions. They're just, obviously I'm right and they're all wrong, right? So they're just yeah, but I think most people are, doing the best they can, but they're really like perpetuating this victimhood that is not going to serve the detransitioners and the people who are trying to kind of walk away from this.
That's a very good point.
Right, and there's no curiosity about it. Then that's where the overlap, that's where the contention is between the think tank people and the recovery people. Is a lot of times the victims, they're taught that they shouldn't be curious. They should just say that's abuse, and it's like, I think recovery is inherently a process of curiosity. It's a process of self-discovery. It's expanding your consciousness beyond the very limited life that you've lived or been conditioned to live. That's why new neural pathways, like traveling and new experiences, you're reprogramming. And you can't reprogram unless you have curiosity to even seek out that new way of being. And so I think they do get stuck in, oh, well, this is just, here's where the line is. The hold the line thing, I think it's taken in extremes, where I understand it's good intention. And I'm a big fan of having boundaries. I think we do need to know what works and what doesn't work for ourselves in life. And there are rules that do tend to work. So I don't want a boundaryless society, but with inside ourselves, if we are going to recover, we need to be curious about what motivates us unconsciously, such as the sexual drives. I mean, this is very Freudian 101 basic stuff. Like, we do need to be very curious. And all of these people are like, why is this happening? Why? And then I'm like, okay, let's be curious about the dark stuff. Yes, it's dark that, John Money's theories turned into this W path thing. Yes, that is something to be curious about, but it doesn't just stop there. Like, I'm doing coaching now for families, and I'm very much psychoanalyzing them and analyzing, like, what is their marital dynamics? How are they bringing issues to this situation? What is their kids' situation? Because it's not helpful to anyone. We already know, like, W path is crazy. Yeah, I know W path is crazy. How is your relationship to yourself, and how is your relationship to your child, and what is their sexuality? What's going on, with their dating life? Like, you have to ask these questions to make any sort of progress. And I think that's why people come to me for coaching, versus they're not going to go to some random rad femme, because the rad femmes, they don't actually have a solution for anything, because they don't have curiosity beyond the political activism.
Yeah. No, I think that's great. I'm glad that you're doing that work, and that hopefully there's lots of people out there who will take you up on that offer. But you make an interesting. Sorry, go ahead, Aaron. I'll flesh out this thought for a second.
Okay. Yeah, the lack of curiosity, I think that's exactly what you were talking about, Tali, early on. It's like 5 years in and you're still saying men can't be women, and like, yeah, W path is crazy. And it's like, yes, we know. Let's get a little deeper and find out why this is happening societally and individually. Like, but yeah, it's just that lack of curiosity that people just stick to their slogans year after year. And yeah. That's all I have.
Yeah, well, and I guess to a certain extent, it's also like, it's kind of like with what you said about Phil being the easy scapegoat. Like, well, we can just make gender ideology the easy scapegoat. And again, it is. Like, I also think, and I say this all the time, like, I don't think trans people are the problem. I think gender ideology is the problem, is that everyone going along with this and telling these, well-meaning trans identified people that, yes, you actually are a man. And anyone who doesn't call you a man doesn't respect you. And any space that doesn't allow you in there is bigoted, right? That's the problem. But yeah, people really do have such a lack of curiosity. And I do have to wonder, at one point, At what point is it just like all of our brains work differently and people like the three of us are super curious and are always going to dig? And at what point is it a protective barrier to sort of maintain a simplified understanding? Because the truth is, the further you deep, the much more complicated it gets. And you find out there aren't very simple good guys and bad guys, that it's really complicated, and that makes it harder to unite around. That's why I think a lot of the successful like sloganeering and stuff is not necessarily rooted in like the most real, like, you know, Aaron and I talk about this too, and this is controversial. And not to say that homosexuals are not being caught up in this, but this idea that like we're transing the gay away is sort of true, especially when we're looking particularly at these like childhood transitioners, the parents who are taking their 4-year-old in, those ones, the early onset children who are being walked down this path are more likely to be the homosexuals, right? Who are showing this sort of effeminacy or something from a young age. But the reality is the overwhelming majority of these young adults and teenagers and stuff who are transitioning aren't gay. And it sounds good to say trans the gay away, and people care about gay rights, so it's a good way. Also, it's kind of like with the rad fem stuff, it's like a way to fight for this and still be on the left and still be
Right.
like be a good person. But are we really if the only sexuality you're talking about when it comes to trans is homosexuality, then you're missing most of the picture.
I mean, yeah, they're transing the straight away. They're transing
are.
the future trad wives away.
They are.
And
Yeah.
thankfully, in my case, I still have my fertility and like came to my senses, and I'm like, okay, I can still like just be a normal woman. But that is what they're. Yeah, no, I agree completely that it's what's successful politically is often not in alignment with deeper thought or philosophy. Like philosophy is not a activist movement, right? Thinking about individual psychology is going to have a much more narrow audience than people that are just like, stop transing kids. And I don't want to sound pretentious, but I just got bored with that many years ago. I'm just like, that's why I'm kind of, not that I'm not doing political work, but I'm kind of turning more of my focus to the individual psychological work, because I'm just like, there's other people that would rather do the political stuff. And I'm like,
carry the banner.
Yeah, it's boring. It's very boring to me. It's not challenging enough. And I just have too much awareness to, you know, sometimes people are like, sometimes you go too deep on these panels when you talk. And I'm like, that's because we don't need 5 people to say the same thing. Like, we should get gender ideology out of schools. I'm like, that's already been covered, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, politically, I get it. And I'm fine with people doing their political work, but I'm not okay with people that are trying to censor us for speaking about the psychoeducational aspects.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And sexuality at the root.
Right. That's what I was going to say. And then whenever it comes down to sexuality, people get really uncomfortable. And part of this is like, again, is the challenge of the fact that for so many people, what piques them or like what they learn about early on in their peaking is the evil caricature of autogynephilia. And as you pointed out in the beginning, it's real. Those people exist. That's why we're able to point to them. But then if that's the only association you have for like trans even being related to sexuality, then of course you're not going to accept that your little cousin could be that, or your friend from work, or your spouse, or your child. You that obviously can't be the good person that you love, right? Because that's what the evil, ugly perverts do. And then people just get all kind of, I find it frustrating too. Like we'll talk about autogynephilia and talk about like the adolescent boys who are autogynephilic. In my personal opinion, it's not a professional opinion, but I think are likely, you know, their sexuality is autogynephilic. People get really upset when you talk about that as if we are somehow like perverting, as if it's perverted for us to talk about that. But they will very happily call that kid gay, right? So it's like we're allowed to talk about sexuality if it fits in what we're already sort of comfortable with, or if there's like a good activist angle for it, right? Everyone wants to protect gay rights. So that's like, we can talk about gay 2-year-olds. In fact, that's totally fine to say that this toddler is clearly a proto-gay kid, but we can't say that this 16-year-old is autogynephilic. even though he is, and he would probably benefit from knowing about this before he goes and castrates himself. But we're not allowed to talk about that because that's sexualizing children in some way. And again, the frustration is that it's coming from our own side. Because yes, when any of us talk about it, the TRAs say, stop worrying about kids' genitals. Okay, I mean, like, gosh, that's so ridiculous. And that's a thought-terminating cliche and all of that. But it's frustrating when it comes from our own side, right? Where it's like, well, you guys are allowed to talk. And again, we're not trying to talk about kids and sexuality. That's not what we're trying to do at all. All of us here agree, right, that we should have a lot less sexualizing of children and a lot less of this material in schools and all of that. But we need to be able to speak plainly. Kids, I was having sexual thoughts, experiences, and motivations as an adolescent, as an early adolescent. Like, yeah, we need to just kind of live in the reality here. And it's frustrating that, like you said, a lot of the pushback that we all get actually comes from our own side of this debate.
Yes. And yeah, you're right. It does come from just associating the art, just AGP is synonymous with predator, right? And, and then when we talk, but it's interesting because when we talk about AAP, it's more like victim, like, because women are always victims in this.
Yes.
And I'm like, dude, I can like just own the fact that I have been victimized in my life many times and I've perpetrated. And
you're like, I was a predatory little horn dog, actually.
Yeah, I was actually. And I've worked really hard to be neither of those things, right? To be a mature person in the world, functioning in relationships. I'm doing my best. And, it's interesting when our own side wants to shut us up. And especially with me, the way that what they say to me specifically is, well, you're just being a handmaiden for these abusers. You still believe in gender ideology. You are, making excuses for male abuse, or because you've been abused, that's why you're making these excuses. And I'm like, I've had to question myself because, well, I believe in questioning myself and I may be wrong about things. So I've had to examine, okay, am I enabling something perverted? Am I enabling something dysfunctional? Or am I merely questioning it or being curious about it? And I've come to the conclusion that by me talking about the lived experience that I've had with these AAP stuff and being curious about it, that's not enabling it. So I wish other people would respect me enough to honor the level of care that I take when I speak on these topics is sometimes excruciating. Like, I try to be as articulate as I can and speak as clearly as I can to not be misunderstood. And then I'm constantly being projected upon and misunderstood. And yet, whenever I speak about any other topic, like, oh, well, Laura's right about 99% of things and she's articulate 99% of the time. But on this, she just has like troon brain still left over or whatever. I'm like, that's really insulting.
Yep.
It is.
I can relate entirely. And sorry, I lost the train of thought. You go on. You go ahead. Tell me what you're going to say.
No, yeah, it's insulting, and those people should be more curious themselves. If I agree with everything else that Laura is saying, is it possible that I haven't that I haven't been curious enough about this one thing? No. Instead, it just means that Laura is totally has this crazy blind spot, right? It's insulting, and I mean, we get that too, that like we're constantly told, Aaron and I, that we believe in gender ideology, that we are just perpetuating another gender ideology. And it's like, and I've had to think about that too, right? I'm like, am I doing this? And as I've like reflected, I'm like, okay, I see where there's the potentiality to give rise to, when we put all these labels out there, it's like, why won't the young kids then just choose these labels now, right? And why wouldn't that then just become a whole new thing that people are identifying into and making their personality and making life changes around? Okay, that's just like possible. I think it's still rooted much more in reality. All of these terms are rooted in the fact that you are your sex, and that this is your sex, that this is something going on with your sexuality, that it's not a mismatched brain and body situation, right? It's still much more rooted, I think, in reality and like physical embodiment. And also, like, we don't believe in gender ideology. We don't believe that even wearing that title of AAP or AGP makes you a man or makes you a woman. And it's like it can feel sometimes like people don't want to hear what we're saying, because it's like, do you really not understand what I'm saying? Because you're a smart person, and I know you're a thoughtful person, and I feel like I've explained this in 100 different ways, and I agree with you, and I really do respect your willingness, and maybe even not just willingness, but need to question yourself, right? Like, need to take some of this criticism seriously. I think that's important for all of us, and I wish some other people would engage in that practice more. But yeah, it's really discouraging how many people are willing to just do that. And then I've also, something that I've heard them say to you and about you is, you believed it once, so we just can't trust anything you have to say, which again just flies in the face of everything else, because they support everything else you have to say. But if you get this one thing wrong to them, well, then you actually should never be taken seriously, Laura, because you were so easily you believed you were a man. Like, and then that's really shitty behavior too. And it's funny because that comes from the people who are in this category of recovery. These are the people who like want to help the poor innocent victims. But if the poor innocent victim says something that they don't agree with, then actually you were an idiot, a pathetic idiot for ever falling into that victimhood to begin with.
Exactly.
It's crazy.
It is.
And it is in some ways just a total mirror image of the TRA side, right? Which is like, we love bomb you. We are the accepting ones. Unless you say something that we don't like, then fuck you. You were, yeah. And it's like a big mask off moment.
It is. And I must, go on, Aaron.
I was just going to say, I remember where I was going with that. It's like, it's also what they're not taking into account is it's incredibly embarrassing to talk about this. There's not like, it's not like I'm not gaining something personally. Like it's like they talk about like, it's like a self-motivated or whatever. It's like, no, I don't want this to be true of myself. I certainly don't want to tell the world that this is true about myself, but I kind of committed to exploring this as honestly as possible. And that's where it led me, unfortunately. So but go on.
Yeah. I mean, it's been helpful to my, being abused and everything creates a lot of shame. And then, to confront that shame through just not shamelessly, but just saying like, yeah, this feels humiliating at times. And I build resilience to understanding that, like, approaching myself with neutrality. So actually speaking about, the more I speak about it, the less ashamed I get. And then they say, well, you're just normalizing. You're normalizing. And I'm like, well, I'm normalizing the human condition so that I can live my life and be free from clinging to my own suffering, and a lot of people never get to that level of practice, of their consciousness. And so I understand why they cling to it, because that's all they have. That's all they can do. They don't even understand how to detach from an emotional experience they're having. And that's why you can say something a million times, but if they're still having an emotional trigger point that they're not working through releasing, they're spiraling inside it perpetually. And obviously that's the same thing with the gender feelings of gender dysphoria, is when these kids get, or whatever, whoever, adults get caught up in these feelings, they think, well, I have to do something about them. And then they end up permanently damaging themselves because of fleeting feelings, that will evolve over time. So I don't like to see it from the side that claims to be about recovery, because what we need is like basic DBT skills here. We need some mindfulness. We need some emotion regulation. We need some distress tolerance, and we need some interpersonal conflict resolution. But they're not really offering that. And, that's why I don't really engage with people that have a purity culture or a wokeness where their system of belief is based on power. And it's just I've kind of moved more to people that are more open-minded, from different walks of life. But I have found that there's more people in the MAGA and the MAHA camp that's now joined this issue for not really trauma reasons. Usually it's more like they're part of the think tank part of it. And they're just like, what's going on with this? And I find those people to be more open-minded than like the DC radical feminists. And then they don't like that, of course, because they're like, well, we were here. We were the hipsters. We were doing this long before Trump and these men came around, like Matt Walsh, before they started talking about it, we were fighting this. And I do empathize with them, but at the end of the day, like, your message is alienating. So
I can only, I appreciate your empathy, and so I will bounce off of that with a bit of a lack of empathy here, because I guess, and I see what you're saying, but you actually just made me realize that one of the main hypocrisies and contradictions in a lot of these people, because there's a large movement of the gender critical movement who are super anti-Trump for whatever understandable reasonings. That's their politics. Those were their preset politics before coming into this, blah blah blah. But you made the point about the purity culture, and that is rampant in GC online spaces. So I'm a bad person if I call a trans person she, because that's what I want to do. But it's okay to like vote for Kamala Harris, who was like giving sex change operations to illegal immigrants in prison. Like that seems like you failed on your purity culture, and again, it's like not that everyone needs to be a single issue voter, but there are like crazy hypocrisies just right there in that. It's like, you're not allowed to ever incorrectly sex somebody, right? You're not allowed to affirm somebody in any way. No pet troons, all of this, right? But you're gonna go on like voting for the party that thinks that trans women should be allowed to play in women's sports, and thinks that, as long as you're on HRT for a certain amount of time, you should be fully allowed into women's spaces. But I'm the one who's not pure enough for your movement. That's crazy to me. That's crazy to me. And I hadn't put that together so explicitly until you just kind of said those things together. And then of course it's like, and I don't give a shit if people didn't vote for Trump. Like, we don't put that back onto other people. And it's just, sorry, this is the last word I'll say and then go to Aaron, but something that probably all of us experience is like, we'll say something in a tweet or whatever that a bunch of people will like, and then they just see anything else we say, and then they're done. Like, that's a big turn off, right? Because people can't deal with nuance, and they don't have an open mind. They're not curious. They're really incurious. And part of that really I think, again, just talking to you now, it's coming out like this. It's a safety thing. If you remain incurious, then you don't need to learn all these things that might challenge something that you believe. Because one of the hardest things to do is to challenge or change a strongly held belief. And a lot of these feminist beliefs are really strongly, deeply held beliefs. And it's really, really scary to have to change your mind. It's scary, but also extremely liberating. My ideological turn was the best thing for me, for my health, like for my mental and physical health, it was so scary to let go of things that I felt like the foundation of who I am as a person was built around believing all of these things. And then it was so liberating to realize I don't need to be married to any idea. I can just seek out really smart people who have smart things to say about all of these things, and then maybe come to my conclusion or not. I might not come to a conclusion. And that's really scary for a lot of people, but I wish they were able to see it the way that I see it. And it sounds like the way that you see it, which is there's actually so much freedom and liberation in that, in not being married to a certain idea or a certain perspective.
Right. It's non-attachment. Like in a Buddhist sense, it's like just not clinging to anything. Like it's not like we do things and function in society. It's not like we're just living in a void of whatever, limitless potential, but it's like, okay, we're allowed to flow. We're allowed to pivot whenever we need to. As I always tell myself, like, I kind of joined the MAGA side of things. But if MAGA starts to do things, and if Trump starts to do things that I don't resonate with anymore, I will give myself the humility to say, I no longer support this. I once did, and I no longer do. And that goes with anything. But I think people are like, all right, so you went from here to here. That's why people like to talk to detransitioners, because they're like, all right, so you were a man and now you're a woman. You put the side-by-side photos and stuff. Those always go viral because it's very simplistic for people.
Yeah.
But I never want to be pigeonholed to anything. If I'm wrong about something and it's not in alignment with my values anymore, then I will say, hey guys, I'm changing my mind. And it's funny that even though I've done this now several times, is what I'm famous for doing, changing my mind, that the rad femmes, once I came out as Trump or whatever, or have these other nuanced beliefs, that they're like, oh, you're changing your mind now? I'm like, I thought that's why you guys liked me.
That's why you ever first cared about me. Yeah, it was that big first mind change. Wow. Yeah, what a good point.
You should we only keep you for about another half an hour or so, but if you want to, could you want to like tell a bit of like your kind of biography of like the early childhood gender feelings or teen gender feelings, and then like the finding trans as a solution, and then the off ramp and all that. If you want to just kind of in case people aren't familiar, most are, I'm sure, but kind of tell that whole that whole story now with the understanding about the maybe AAP at the root. Or I'd also be curious to pick your brain about the whole difference between what I call autogynophobia, that is a byproduct of autoandrophilia, versus what you call, or what most people call, internalized misogyny. I'm wondering if you thought much about like where that line is, or if there is one. Yeah.
Do you know what we mean by autogynophobia?
Maybe explain more.
So sorry, is it okay if I explain it, Aaron?
Sorry, yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Okay. It's the inverse of, so this is everything with autoandrophilia is beyond what the sexologists have established, right? Because the sexologists really only have kind of established autogynephilia. So everyone who's talking about this happening in females as autoandrophilia, we're all kind of doing a bit of speculation. But so autogynophobia is the opposite of autoandrophobia, which is essentially dysphoria for autogynephiles. So this term was coined to describe the contempt and disgust that autogynephiles feel for the male parts of themselves. So oftentimes this will be physical, right? So it might be like anatomical things that they like, feeling disgust over the parts of their body that really read as male to the public. It also could be more sort of behavioral and psychological, like disgust with like ever being seen as someone who could hurt a woman, right? And so autogynophobia is the opposite, is in females, is the sort of the contempt for their womanliness, the contempt for femaleness. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, thinking about that, I guess I'll talk a bit about the AAP aspects of my stories. The other stuff is pretty like standard out there already, but as a kid, I definitely was what you would describe as a tomboy. I pretty much, I think basically after maybe kindergarten, I just wanted to mostly, almost exclusively wear boys' clothes, shoes, have short hair. I was never had any interest in makeup or nail polish or anything that was coated with that kind of femininity. And I guess for me, there was part of a practical aspect to it. I was a kid that liked to be very physical and outside. I like to wrestle. I like to play in the sand, get dirty. I was just like, who gives a shit about my clothes getting dirty, whatever. I was very down to earth. And I wasn't really disgusted by that kind of stuff, like uncleanliness or bugs or animals or things that I found a lot of the girls that had a stronger disgust response. And I also found that a lot of the girls, I don't know, they were like more conscientious and more agreeable. Like if we're thinking about personality psychology, they're more agreeable. So they were, you know, I don't know, they were more submissive, is it another word to put it? Whereas I was more of a dominant personality and more independently minded. So if a group of girls were doing a game and I didn't want to do it, I would just walk off and I wouldn't play with them, which is not very typical for females, because typically females are going to like go along to get along. For me, I was just like, what's the point of that? I think maybe even to maybe some of an extreme that I'm like, yeah, that wasn't really very pro-social of me to be doing. But I grew up very lonely because of this kind of stuff. I didn't relate to other girls. I was in Girl Scouts, and I wish that I could be in Boy Scouts. And no, it seems, again, I think I went too extreme with it because I was immature, right? Like when the girls, we had to sit around and talk about our feelings all the time. I found that very boring. Now I love doing that. It's my favorite thing to do. But so I think I denied a lot of my actual genuine, authentic femininity and realizing actually how feminine I was. Like I had a very strong nurturing instinct. It was just going towards like stuffed animals instead of like a human baby. But it was always there. And so I'm seeing I wasn't that different than all other girls. I was just somewhat different. I was different enough where it was causing me problems functioning and having friends. And I felt extremely lonely and alienated. But I also didn't really relate to the boys much either. I looked at boys as another species as well. I think it's an autism thing to look at both girls and boys your own age as different species. It's not like, oh, I am a boy, like that old school transsexual type thing where it's like, oh, when am I going to grow a penis or something like that? It was more like, where do I fit in here? Like, I don't fit in over here or here. And I tend to get along with girls better because I found girls to be smarter and less annoying. I found the boys to be too stupid. But, you know, those were some of my early kind of feelings of social alienation related to gender. And then in terms of sexual development, I've had a pretty long-standing sexual relationship with myself. I have mastered in a long-term committed relationship to myself. I definitely have been masturbating since probably the age of like 5 or 6. I didn't obviously know what it was. It's not like I was doing it because I was groomed to do it. It was just something that I was doing. Self-stimulation from a very young age, and then not really knowing what it was, and then started watching porn probably around the age 12. It started out as very very romantic. I would look up like couples making love and things like that. It's very feminine. But then that porn, there isn't as much of it, and there's just a lot more porn that plays with power dynamics and other more complicated things. So then I started getting into pretty degrading straight porn, and around probably 14. And then that's around the age when people started questioning, like, are you a lesbian? Because I was only wearing boys' clothes and I just had a more blunt personality. And meanwhile, I have some pretty severe daddy issues. So I was like, had my whole bedroom covered in posters of male rock stars and actors and comedians. And they're like, are you a lesbian? And I'm like, dude, look at my walls. Like, you really think I'm into the ladies? Like, please. But I was dressing like a butch lesbian. Or you could say I was dressing like an autistic straight girl that had low self-esteem. And those two
we have
things
so much to say.
similar,
we have a lot to say
they?
about this. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested. So then I started finding other people like me for the first time on Tumblr, finding other girls that also had that likes like way older men, rock stars from the 70s and 80s, artistic, funny, whatever, depressed. And some of them were in the queer ideology. And I was raised in a liberal household, so Democrat voting. And I was very into all the movements, so the BLM and Me Too movement, all that stuff. And so, of course, I found gender ideology. And of course, to someone like me who had never felt belongingness with men or women, I was like, well, yeah, of course I'm non-binary. Like, that's the perfect word to describe me. But I'm like, but I am just a straight female, aren't I? Like, if I'm being clinically honest, I'm a straight female. But then I started having these very confusing relationships with gay men. And I had 3 different unrequited loves for gay male friends of mine and 2 of them used me to figure out they were gay. And so that was detrimental to my well-being. I was very suicidal. I was in these codependent, obsessive relationships with these guys that just could not fully love me. And I was like, you'll hold hands with me, we'll talk every day, but you won't kiss me, you won't have sex with me. And that just, I couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance. And because I'd been abused by my dad, I just was like, well, it's all my fault. It's my body, you know. And so that, long story short, I ended up coming out as trans when I was 18 as a gay trans man. And I was calling myself androsexual because I'm like, well, I'm technically not homosexual because I have a female body, you know, but I'm like, all right, I'm an androsexual and I want to be a gay man. And that didn't end up working out. And I ended up, you know, taking testosterone and I had my breasts removed. And then I detransitioned at 22 after I realized that this all came from trauma. So I don't believe that autoandrophilia was at the root of my transition. I believe that abuse is at the root of my transition, that I had a fragmented sense of reality and I couldn't distinguish between fantasy and reality. And I was kind of living in a fantasy world with these relationships, with my well-being, because I didn't have a groundedness in reality because I'd been gaslit and abused chronically. And I had brain damage from it. So, however, I do understand that heterosexuality was an enormous risk factor for me to fantasize about transitioning because I desperately wanted to be loved. I desperately wanted to have physical intimacy, sexual intimacy. I wanted to have a partner. I wanted romance. And I was disassociated from femininity, even though I clearly was female. And that just kind of got turned around and flipped inside out, and me feeling like, well, I have to go one way or the other. I have to either be I'm too masculine to attract a straight man, but I'm too feminine to attract a gay man. So the only option I have is a bisexual man. Or maybe if I want to be more with gay men or increase my odds, I should get more masculine. And since I was already my whole life not being what I thought was not being feminine, I could never have seen myself, you know, living the way I am today, which is I'm very comfortable wearing dresses or sort of performing these feminine mating rituals, as I think of them as, like you put on makeup and you enhance your physiognomy, and then men are attracted to you and they want to have a baby with you. You know, all these kind of ev psych things that I'm now very into because I want to get married and have a baby. So yeah, that's just kind of the rundown. I'll just let you guys ask follow-up questions.
Yeah. So, okay, you said so many things that I want to respond to. I'll start with the end of it. That fork in the road that you describe is something that Aaron and I sort of addressed like earlier on in our show here in some of the earlier episodes of like, yeah, when you're sort of at this crossroads and you have to decide basically, am I going to lean in to try to basically become a man, or will I just try to emphasize my femininity, like lean into this path of least resistance in many ways. And we were trying to come to terms with like, why would people not go the lean into the femininity route first? And especially now we have theories. I don't know how familiar you are with them, but that the autoandrophilia essentially like also describes a lot of self-identified lesbians, not all lesbians, but especially ones with dysphoria and stuff like that. And we were trying to understand, like, especially for people who call themselves lesbians and claim that they are essentially repulsed by men. It's like, why would the choice that you would go down be to like approximate men more? So to me, the underlying autoandrophilia makes sense because I think to an outsider, it wouldn't make sense. Like, why, if you're at this fork in the road, why would you choose the one that's going to require like a lot of extra steps, basically, as opposed to leaning into the femininity? But I think it makes sense if you have a strong some type of internal aversion to femininity or to your femaleness, or if you have a real propensity towards masculinity, if you really love and admire masculinity. Those things make sense as to why someone would choose the sort of harder path there.
I agree.
Yeah. And then some of you said that you don't think autoandrophilia was the root of your transition. That makes total sense. And what I'm about to do is not try to convince you out of that. I want to, in fact, maybe elaborate more on what I mean when I say something like at the root of it. Because I think you're right. That I think autoandrophilia and autogynephilia are very rarely the root. And I think this is where a lot of people are, especially transitioned people who are living as trans, are really opposed to these labels, because it suddenly sounds like you're telling them that this whole life that they've constructed for lots of complicated reasons is about sex. And it's not for them. That is not, like, most autogynephiles, they don't transition because they have autogynephilia. They transition because they're dysphoric, because they really want to approximate femininity. And the longer they live in this space, they start to feel like they really are more feminine, and again, some of them are living in anyone, I think, who's living in the sort of gender ideology framework is living in delusion. But people aren't actually transitioning because of this atypical sexuality. So it is an oversimplification to say that. So I actually appreciate that you made that distinction, because I think that, the way that we're communicating it does not really communicate what we're trying to express fully, which is that this is the root that could be the determining factor potentially, right? Or is part of the reason why the masculinity looks like the better option, essentially.
I just call it a vulnerability factor. Like, it
go.
makes you more vulnerable to this fantasy, to this delusion. And it's confusing, and it's harder to ground yourself in your own reality of sex when you do. And I did want to speak to what you were saying, like the internalized misogyny versus the phobia of the femininity. I think that's a big part of it. Like, I think for me, again, internalized misogyny is kind of a generic and kind of vague term that I only use in certain contexts when people know what I'm saying, like in the rad femme context. I had just self-hatred in general. Like, it wasn't about being female. I was just abused and called like a worthless piece of shit very often. Right. So it wasn't because I was a female, but I am a female. And so I internalized that hate as a woman. And I grew up as a self-hating girl. And so I often say the moment when I stopped believing in the ideology is the moment when I accepted my reality as an abused girl versus a gay trans man. I was an abused woman. I didn't want that to be my reality. I was dissociating from it, but it was my reality. I grew up with abuse as a female, and that's a specific experience that's different than as a male, as a straight female as well. And that's why I had so many unavailable relationships with men, because that's a straight, female abuse experience. And so, I agree that it's more about an aversion to the feminine. Like, I'm very upfront about that. I have a preference for masculinity. I have in many ways, not always, but male voices, for instance. I have a strong preference for male voices versus female voices. I'm attracted to men. I like men's bodies. There isn't a part of a man's body that I don't enjoy. I am not attracted in the same way to a female's body. I think it's very beautiful. I've come to accept the beauty of my own female body, and I've gone into all that, like, feminine goddess energy and all that kind of stuff, which I never thought I would. But I'm not sexually attracted to it. I now understand I want to be the counterpart to the masculine. I want to receive the masculine, right? I want to have a penis inside of my vagina. Like, that's what I actually want. I don't actually need to have a penis myself in order to find joy in life.
Right.
So yes, there's a preference for the masculine. And again, some of it's and again, we can discuss the different theories of why is there a preference to the masculine? Like, is this a mother wound thing where, because a lot of the clients I see, they're over identifying with one parent and who's way more overactive. And it's usually the mother. And it's like, how does that interfere with a child's development of their own relationship to femininity and masculinity? Like, I relate a lot more to my dad because he's the creative one who likes art and music, versus my mom is not really into that kind of stuff. You know, how did that influence? I'm wearing a Van Halen shirt today. And when I think of Van Halen, I think of my dad, because there's videos of me when I was 3 years old, like singing Van Halen because of him. You know, like, I didn't choose to like Van Halen. He conditioned me to like Van Halen, which is fine. He's conditioned way worse things than me, believe me.
Yeah.
But, but I think it's very useful to discuss our preference, and even viewing it through the lens of love and affection. I have such an affection for men that I don't have for women. And it does come from that deep evolutionary drive to mate with the opposite sex. It comes from heterosexuality. And I was trying to mimic the thing that I was naturally drawn to. And I naturally was turned off by a lot of females' behaviors. But that's not to say that, obviously, now as a mature person, there's a lot of male typical behavior that I don't like. And that it doesn't need to be one or the other, but I can still say, you know, in retrospect, that when I was at that crossroads, I definitely thought, how could I ever force myself to be inauthentic? It felt inauthentic for me to say, oh yeah, I just suddenly want to like wear lipstick and makeup and like wear a dress. That felt like a costume to me, versus wearing, you know, cargo shorts and a Hawaiian shirt felt authentic to me because that's what I liked. You can't just force yourself not to like things. And I don't think you should. My whole thing is about radical acceptance. Like, you can be a girl who's horny and who wears Hawaiian shirts and you're still a straight woman. Okay. How can we help you to bridge the gap between your reality, which is complicated, and the fantasy you have of having sex with men or whatever it is, right? Let's bridge the gap of your reality to the fantasy that you want. And I could, if I had like a fucking matchmaker or something, maybe that would have helped me. That there have been like, you can keep this stuff, but like, what if you also signaled in this way? And then you could attract that and it's just like practical, basically social skills, courtship skills. And I was just like not taught any of this. I was obviously taught,
which is
abused.
very
So
anti-feminist.
Cut my breasts off.
Yeah. Well, it's very anti-feminist in some ways. Like the feminist mindset wouldn't like you saying like, okay, I feel more comfortable in cargo shorts and a Hawaiian shirt, but I do want to be with a man. I want to be desired by a man. And so I'm going to wear this stuff that I don't love as much. I don't feel as drawn to, but this is how I can sex signal to get what I want. Right.
Well, I'm not saying that we wear the things we're not drawn to. I'm saying develop a curiosity and an openness, which is what I ended up doing. I was like, you know what? And I'll say this is very AAP, I feel. I only started wearing like mascara or things because I was like, you know what? There's like male rock stars that wear it. Like, if they can wear it, why can't I? You know, It was a curiosity, and it eventually became genuine. So I'm not saying, oh, convert yourself to wearing something you don't like. I'm saying be more open-minded and find things that work in your style that still signal that you're straight.
Yeah.
And part of that is your behavior and attitude as well.
Yeah. No, that's true. And I agree. And I agree. Like, I don't think that people should wear something they hate and feel horrible in. But there is this idea that to change yourself at all to be more attractive or appealing to people that you want to be with is somehow like an awful anti-feminist. Like, yeah, you've just like given into the patriarchy and you hate yourself. And I think that's really toxic messaging. And also, I see this is a debate that I've seen and I've tried to talk about a little bit on the trans side too, which is this conversation, or it's kind of on in the trans and gender critical discourse, I guess, because everyone has this idea of like, what is authentic, right? And like, what is natural? And it's like, oh, okay, well, it's kind of like you were saying, like from a very young age, you were drawn to boy clothes, boy shoes, boy stuff. But upon reflection, you weren't necessarily masculine. But then there's people who will say like, so then you were faking it in some way. It's like, well, if you're not naturally masculine, then liking masculine things is somehow phony. And I'm like, well, no. If it's a natural affinity, like you said, like you're drawn to these things, that's natural. That is natural. That is like that is you being sincere and authentic. If that's what you're drawn to, it doesn't mean that you have to like dispositionally be more masculine in some way to be naturally and authentically drawn to these masculine things. And I think people get really like, I guess this leads me to the next thing that you said that I wanted to touch on. It's just like people get kind of confused between masculinity and maleness and femininity and femaleness and like what these things really mean. And it gets into, God, there's a lot of places I want to go here. So you guys might need to rein me in, but this idea of like, you looked like a butch lesbian, right? And it's sort of like, it brings up a good question of what the hell does that mean, right? Because there are people who, and Aaron and I talked about a little bit on our last episode, there are people who think of a butch lesbian as basically a gender. They are, or a subset of the female sex, that they are this really masculine, naturally masculinized group of women who you could paint them up and dress them up, but they would look like drag queens. They are just so naturally meant to be like this. Is that actually true? Like, Aaron and I think not really. A lot of butch lesbianism is women, kind of regular women with an affinity for masculine clothing. And that is A-okay. Yes. That's my wife. That's my wife, To call her, like, I call her a masculine woman because it helps, like, get the idea across, like, or a butch lesbian, because it communicates the message. You get the picture in your mind. She's not manly, like, in meaningful ways, like, she has an affinity for masculinity. She has an affinity for, like, being in that role in a way, but she's not manly in any real meaningful way. And okay, two places I want to go with this. The first is it's very interesting and obvious that the people in your life thought you might have been a butch lesbian. Because again, we look at is kind of, oh, Laura wears she must be really masculine in some way, right? Because she likes like men's clothing. And
I have to say, I got the exact same thing as a teenager. That exact, like everybody thought I was a lesbian. In my mind, I'm like, I'm the absolute opposite of a lesbian. Was how I was like, yeah, I love some men so much I want to be one, and the thought of like female on female stuff grossed me out. Obviously, that drastically changed later in life. But no, I completely agree. Everyone was like, oh, Aaron must be a lesbian, and I was like, oh no,
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. And then I just think about back to the kind of the beginning of our conversation, how so many people in our movement, if they saw 14-year-old Laura, would have said, protect this proto-gay child.
And I would have been like,
they would have. I'm not even I'm being funny, but they would have. They would have.
I know they would have. No, they would have. It's so true, dude.
Yeah. And it's like, we're playing with stereotypes on both sides of this sides of this fight. I know the gender critical side likes to think that they are above the stereotypes, but they're not. And this becomes more evident when we're talking about like style and stuff like this. And there's this like weird contradiction on the gender critical side that sort of says that like men and women are so different. Sex is a really meaningful distinction, which obviously I agree it is. In such a way that like it's obvious and there kind of are these clear boundaries, but also men and women are basically the exact same. And if you're a woman and you like all that's totally fine, because the only difference is the penis and the vagina, right? And it's like, and I don't know how they even hold these two things together, really. That I don't know how they don't deal with the cognitive dissonance. But two last things I'm going to jump around, and then hopefully one of you guys will take this one of the strands that I put out here. What you said about autism gender is something that Aaron and I keep coming back to. We can't get away from it. I pledged a while ago that I would not use the word autism ever again because I got so much shit for talking about it, but I'm just using it again. And I don't mean necessarily a clinical diagnosis or anything like that. But
you have one, correct, Laura?
I do. I was diagnosed at 11.
Okay, cool. So now we can talk about it.
There you go.
Thanks to your doctor for allowing me to talk about this now. But there is something so real, and you said it verbatim for how Aaron and I have been talking about it, which is there's this confusion that happens in some of these kind of aspie autistic young people and young adults which is they interpret themselves as being masculine or feminine because they're not super like the kids of their own sex. And I just saw this play out in an interview that Chloe Cole did with a male detransitioner on her channel. And his like idea of sort of why he was feminine was because he didn't like to play sports as much as the other guys, and he wasn't so rough and tumble. And like you were saying, it's like in hindsight, it's not that you related so much to the boys, but you didn't feel like you related to the girls. And that was supposed to be the natural fit. And I think that's something that I guess the gender criticals notice this, and they don't always say it in the nicest way, but it would be really helpful, again, in the sort of psychoeducation realm of helping people who are going through this to kind of get a more honest look at this of like, do these things make you masculine, right? Or do they make you a quirky woman? Are these like quirky aspects of your femininity? And also, and maybe you do have masculine traits, and that's all good and great and wonderful. But there seems to be this recurrent thing again with people who might be on the spectrum or somewhere near whatever the autism spectrum, where they see themselves as the opposite sex because they feel dissimilar to their own sex, not even because they necessarily feel so similar to the opposite sex. And this becomes really obvious when we see so many of these autistic, autogynephilic transsexuals out there who are so obviously not feminine. They're not feminine at all. But you can kind of see how they didn't feel like bros, right? Like, and to them, because they weren't bros, they were more like women. And we can all make fun of it as females here, but it makes sense how you thought that in the exact opposite way too. Like, well, I'm not just like the women, so maybe I'm actually a man. And like, that's obviously hilarious. Like, no, obviously
you weren't. Not a man, a gay man. To me, that was very different than a straight man. And that's important too. Because like this idea like, oh, gay man and butch lesbian are like this unique other thing. I mean, they kind of are in some ways, but the sex obviously remains the same. But I didn't relate to straight men whatsoever. I did relate to what I was projecting on gay men is like, oh, they can be campy and they can be artistic and emotional and sensitive and horny and still love and be loved by men. Really, I was just like, a fucking quirky, sensitive, artistic, straight woman. I was not a gay man whatsoever, of course, right? But like that, like separating out the like such individualist philosophy and not ever coming back to the whole is detrimental when we make something so discrete that we can't even remember why it belonged to the whole in the first place. Like the gay man being so unique and different. Or, like I'm a big fan of labels. I think categories are good, but also they're categorizations within the greater human experience. They're not a separate thing. And it's just these discrete labels that trip me up because then I was like, okay, but I'm this, and this. And it's like, yeah, you are all that as a female. And no one reminded me of that or no one cared.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and again, going back to our side and even this like more niche side of our side and these labels is a lot of people get up, like you were just alluding to, Tali, get all mad at us for talking about autism and AGP, AAP. And they're like, oh, don't go talk about labels. We need to talk about people. But I'm like, these labels are very important because we're seeing this obvious trend, repeat. And it's really important to know why there's this overlap. What makes these, like you're pointing out, Laura, vulnerable to this kind of sexual desire versus what the self should be. It seems to be a distinctly autistic experience to make that mistake. And so many
seems
people,
to be a risk factor. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. There we go. Yeah. And so many people on our side are just like, yeah, we know we can't even say autism anymore because they don't want to make that distinction because
horny.
Well, because they want the AGPs to be the victims and the autists to be the villain.
Other way around. Definitely the other way around. Yeah.
Right. And so if you're saying, oh, this autism experience seems to be distinctly like linked to the autosexual experience, then it's like it just crumbles the victim villain paradigm that they're so attached to. And yeah.
No, you're so right, because those same people who, again, like I was basically triggered into not using that word anymore. Again, obviously I'm defying that here, but those same people who were really upset with us, and some of it felt like, again, I had to consider what they were saying. Like there is good reason here. Like, are we blending too many things together? Yeah, probably. Autism spectrum disorder kind of does that. That's kind of the whole thing with the spectrum, is that there's like so many different presentations all under the same umbrella, and we don't really entirely understand the mechanism. And so I could be pulling in people who don't fit for this. Okay, fine. But like you said, Aaron, there's a pattern. We ignore patterns at our own peril. You know what I mean? Like, we are seeing this come up over and over again. And those same people who are very upset with Aaron and I for talking about what we see as there seems to be a big link between autism and this autosexual stuff, those people are very happy to list the statistics coming out of the Tavistock that said like 33% or something of the trans kids at that clinic were autistic. Okay, so we're not making this up. So, but like you said, it's because we're talking about the autosexual side. We're bringing it into the sexuality, whereas the framing of the people who are okay with talking about autism and trans as a risk factor is that, that autistic kids are so developmentally behind. They can't even understand. They're going to be taken advantage of. They don't kind of know what they're doing. It's not concordant with the message that we're saying, which is actually a lot of these people are kind of the horny ones, right? With maybe even with less, they feel less of the same like social pressures to hide some of these things. Like, and we should be able to talk about this, but it really, we got, that was like the most pushback we've ever gotten, was talking about autism with autosexuality.
Yeah, there's a lot of victim classes that people just have already decided. And it's just like, okay, well, autistic people can be assholes too, or predators as well. Like, they're not just innocent. Again, it's just, it's unnecessary. And I know that it all comes down to the human nature, and that we want to make things as simple as possible, because if we really examined everything, we'd have to probably radically change our lives, and it's not many people want to be in constant change and evolution all the time. I get that. But to the people that are willing to be in constant change and evolution all the time, it's very frustrating to deal with them. So the autism, I don't understand autism. I don't fucking understand it. And I was diagnosed with it. I don't fucking understand it. All I know is that there were certain symptoms that I'm like, yes, this clusters in a way that can be called this. And I'm fine with using this label, even though it might be arbitrary in certain ways, whatever. But we have to look at the fact that human beings, when they don't know what the hell is going on, they mimic their surroundings. That the monkey see, monkey do. Okay. We know this as toddlers, that we are going to mimic things. That's how we learn. And if someone doesn't have good social skills, or they're overwhelmed emotionally, or whatever it is, they're going to mimic what they're drawn to, or what they think they should be drawn to. And these people, including myself, are mimicking the opposite sex in such an extreme role-playing type of way that we're mimicking this, when really we should be teaching them how to have social skills as their sex. Because being an abused girl, which was my physiological reality, and being on Grindr, for instance, I'm not living a gay trans lifestyle. I'm living a abused girl who's using Grindr lifestyle, and that's not helpful. So yeah, sex stereotypes are an inconvenient and uncomfortable truth, and there's variations within them, but the alternative is to ignore very overt vulnerabilities that these populations have. Women have specific vulnerabilities, men have specific vulnerabilities, and autistic people have specific vulnerabilities. And to ignore them is actually undignified. Like, if you're lying to me about something, even by omission, that is disrespectful to me. You should be telling me the truth, no matter what it is, and especially to a child. And anything less than that is, in my opinion, evil. I think lying is evil. So these people that want to pretend that this stuff isn't happening at whatever side it is, I just can't tolerate that.
Mm-hmm. You just said something that I think might be the most controversial amongst any lesbian, or not lesbians, feminists who may be tuning in, which is that we should teach kids what is appropriate behavior for their sex. And I think that's
I know. Yeah.
I think I don't Yeah, I'm not sure. Obviously, as the cliche goes, the older I get, the more conservative I get, and so I can very much see the societal and interpersonal usefulness of that. I just think as a wider society, and certainly in like the liberal corners, that's that's going to be yeah.
But it's coming from a rad femme perspective. When I think of some of this, it's like when I say that, I'm thinking like, hey, we need to teach girls that they exist in a world where they can get impregnated.
Right.
That
They need to be tuned
teach them how to exist in their sex in society. That's part of what I'm saying. It's not like a sex role stereotype. It's like, this is a possibility that you need to protect yourself against.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think too, something, I don't know how exactly you brought this up for me, but something that I was thinking while you were speaking, Laura, is like, we need to be teaching people, right, sort of like the wide array of like what being a member of their sex looks like. And it should be a wide range, because it is. That's the reality, right? We should all be living in reality. And we also need to acknowledge when those differences are there and tell people that you don't need to do anything about it. I kind of think that's the big issue that we're having right now. And I think to my wife and her like confession to me of her dysphoria, however many years ago now. And all I knew to do with that was to help her transition. We need to like take a step back and it's like these confessions and these feelings can be affirmed as just real and just part of you and part of your experience as a woman and part of your experience as a gay woman or whatever it is, as a funky straight woman, like as an artist, as a tortured art, right? Like these are just part of your experience. And I think that's kind of the problem we have now is like, or that we could run into, right? It's like tell people kind of their expectations or the general parameters. And then also it's like, if you go outside of these, that's just okay. Like that just makes you an atypical version of this thing. Because yeah, again, when my wife told me this, all I knew to do was to affirm. And literally it was like, okay, so what do we do next? Like now the action starts. It's like someone tells you that they have these feelings or these desires and you're supposed to do something about it from a good place. Like otherwise it's unloving and uncaring. Like someone gave you their truth. You can't just ignore it. We kind of can ignore some of this stuff. Maybe not all of this stuff needs to be ruminated on constantly. Maybe you should have someone in your right. Maybe you should.
We don't need to. We just feel things, and it gives us information, and then we take action. But that doesn't mean that feelings need to rule our lives. I mean, it all comes back to like non-attachment, which I'm not saying is easy, but I mean that's for me what it is, you know, in life.
Yeah, and then just one last thing that you said that was a launch pad for me is talking about just sort of evolutionary psychology. And that also played a huge role in my ideological change. And it kind of started with like listening to Brett and Heather and stuff like that. And I just, again, that's when my feminism ended, frankly. And also when I was just fully liberated. Because if you want to make things equal and the same, and you need to like expend so much energy and thought to make sense of all of these differences, when you could just say it's like it's out of my hands, you know, like it just is. This just is. This is the universe that has existed so far before I got here and will exist so far. And even just putting that then in the context of like we do this because these are reproductive strategies of our species, and we are one of a bajillion species, and like we are animals, and it's so. I see how for some people it's scary to go down that route, and a lot of radical feminists don't like evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, but it really is so liberating, I think, to have that like that context of we are one of many animals on this earth. And we have evolved for our species to continue to perpetuate. And it explains all of the ugly things that we want to blame on men and women. It just explains them and doesn't excuse them. It explains them. Like when you can understand things like rape and you know, like really horrible, awful things through the context of evolutionary psychology, I think it is really liberating. And I recommend more people go down that route. Not necessarily as a serious study, but just I think just this, even the smallest understanding can really like free up a lot of space, energy, weight, whatever it is.
It really does.
Yeah, if you want to solve like a social problem, you can't deny the reality of like the root of that social problem.
Yeah.
And that really requires acknowledging evolutionary psychology and why
Yeah.
males and females are so different. It doesn't have to be a bad thing,
Yeah.
and it doesn't all have to be fixed. But yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on and talking to us. You didn't tell us too much of your story, but I really had a good time, and I hope the listener will have a good time just kind of like listening to our brainstorming about the philosophy and of all the gender and the gender critical discourse. I think there's a lot of really good stuff talked about here.
Yeah, I mean, I have a million other interviews where I don't get to go into this. So I know I tell my story a million times, but rarely do I get to just speak truth in this level of depth. It rarely gets to this point. And so it's refreshing to be able to just talk about EvPsych and talk about these different camps in such a meta level that often I can't get into, and I go on like Fox News or something.
Yeah. I loved this conversation. I'm really glad that we finally all got our schedules together. I think this was great. I'm excited to listen to it back already. So thank you so much, Laura.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.